Welcome, Professor. I think you feel at home here at the Romanian Cultural Institute. You used to work here. Just let's start by talking a little bit about your time here, and then we will go on talking about this huge cultural personality and this very important first director of this institution.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here, Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Director, everyone. I'm obviously very happy to be here. As you can understand, there are multiple layers for me here. I was a couple blocks down on 2nd Avenue when the Romanian Library opened, technically in 1969, but basically in 1971 when we arrived in New York. I lived 2 blocks down the street. I still remember from back then, Marin Sorescu, Ana Blandiana, Romul Susan, Marcel Chibnoaga, people who would pass through our apartment because this was kind of the opening of the 1970s. So that was a first kind of layer for me.
What a cool time to grow up, you know, surrounded by all these big names of Romanian culture.
Absolutely, but then going back to Romania in 1974 and seeing the 80s was not quite as fun, I must say. And I never thought at that time that I would be back in New York, let alone at the Romanian Library as it was back then. But the 90s came, I changed careers. I used to be a physicist. Everybody was a physicist back in Romania back then.
Or an engineer, right?
Or engineer. My wife was a physicist as well. So, and yes, I joined the Romanian Foreign Ministry. It was a fascinating time. It was a time of change, obviously, especially when it came to foreign policy. And I ended up here at the Romanian Cultural Center back then. And once more, when I left in 1997, I thought I'd never be back here again. I'm in Chicago, I don't live in New York. So it's been 20 plus years since I've been here. So thank you, I'm very grateful for the invitation. I'm very grateful for being here. And indeed, this means a lot to me, so much that I actually prepared something. I usually don't prepare for my students, although I love them. But for my father, I had prepared something. So going back to your question, obviously this was a very important moment kind of from the broader international relations perspective. The way you could think about it is really it was an opening up of Romania, and it wasn't by pure chance that Romania opened up in the late 1960s. I would argue, and I know that there are people here like Professor Branea who might disagree with me, but I would argue that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a big moment in the Cold War. It scared everybody tremendously. So much so that in the Soviet Union, things started opening up even more. And because of that, in Romania kind of saw, and Ceausescu saw, a model for opening up from Khrushchev. You may or may not be aware, but there was, back in the mid-1950s, late 1950s, and even in the 1960s, there was a cultural opening in the Soviet Union. There were also about 2 million Soviets who were allowed to travel. Half of them ended up in the West. So when Ceausescu came to power in 1965, he had a model of how he could open up if he wanted to the culture. But he also saw a moment when Romania could play a role, a greater role than usual, in international relations. And it also happened that Richard Nixon was president. A lot of people might not be aware, but in 1967 he had a personal visit to Romania. In 1969 he became the first American president to visit Romania. And as far as I know, the first American president to visit a communist country after World War II. And that's the moment in 1969 when Nixon comes to Romania that that the U.S. and Romania realized that there's an opening, there's a moment, and that's when they signed the opening of the Romanian Library. And this is, I don't want to make this as a unique moment in any way, because the Romanian Foreign Ministry at that time was doing a lot of things. Again, trying to mix things up, let's put it this way. It was the first country in Eastern Europe to recognize West Germany. It was the only country in the world, as far as I know, that recognized both Israel and the PLO. Later on, Romania played a really important role in getting the Americans and the Chinese to talk. And eventually, they also played an important role in getting Sadat to visit Israel. So this is the broader context. That's what I want you to understand. This was not by pure chance, something happening in 1960s. Oh, let's just open a library. And it was important, and that is really, it's a combination of the interest in opening up the culture, and as well, the foreign policy interests, broad ones. And I also want to mention, especially because there are members of the Romanian diplomatic corps here, there's a tradition. Of course, there were important changes after 1990, but there were traditions that Romania played throughout, even before World War II, really important roles, sometimes more than its weight throughout history. And in the 1960s, it also happened that in Washington, D.C., Corneliu Bogdan was the ambassador. He was ambassador for about 10 years. And he was central to all this. At the United Nations, it was Ion Dacu who was ambassador to the United Nations. So this is a really important moment out of which the Romanian Library comes. And I know I didn't answer exactly.
Such a tiny institution for a war that big, you know. And it's great that you mention all these contexts. The fact that the library didn't appear, you know, out of blue air. That it was part of a détente. It was part of a rapprochement that was quite extraordinary at the time. And what about? I think it was the only cultural center of a communist country in New York at the time, and one of the few in the world.
So yes, absolutely. And as far as I know, for a long time, actually, it was the only. And let me just add to that, that as far as I know from my father, that was a tremendous advantage for him as well, and for the Romanian Library. There was a lot of interest. You won't be surprised if I tell you that it had a tiny, tiny budget. I think everything has a tiny budget these days, but back then it certainly did. But
nothing changes.
Nothing changes. But what complemented it was that there was a tremendous interest in the U.S. for Romania, like the ambassador spoke earlier. It was a curiosity having an East European library, East European cultural center here. And my father and his staff were invited to present Romanian art, to speak about Romanian literature, to speak about Romanian culture, and not just in New York. I remember trips, I was young back then, I didn't go to all of them. He took my sister sometimes he went alone, I was sad. But he went, you know, Colorado, he was in Chicago, he was in New Orleans and so on. So there was a true interest on behalf of the American public for this weird East European culture that nobody knew. They're always surprised that it's a Romance language and it's not a Slavic language. So because it was the only one, it raised a lot of interest, and it was able to promote Romanian culture across a lot of institutions in the West.
But Professor Grigorescu had been in the United States for quite some time when he was appointed first director of the library. What was he doing in the United States? Why was he?
So this is part of the opening that I was talking about, a combination. I mean, there were multiple things happening at the same time, Romania and international relations. But the cultural opening was definitely there, and it was happening in Romania as well. And at that time, starting around actually 1969, around the same moment, a lot of Romanian professors came not just to the United States, in many Western countries. That was the opening up. My father was a professor in not sure how to translate it, Facultatea de Litere, let's say the Language and Literatures department. And because of that, more than half of his colleagues traveled through Fulbright, IREX, all sorts of fellowships in the United States, in France, in Britain, a lot of places. So there were a lot of opportunities for them to come as professors to teach for a couple of years and then go back. I have a whole list, I'm not going to read it for you, of the professors who traveled at that time. It's easy to find. But it wasn't just in Romanian literature, in modern languages. Well, my father was a professor at the University of Washington, for example. There was a professor from
Seattle.
Yes, in Seattle. A professor from biology. There was somebody who later on was the rector of the Polytechnical Institute. He was in Oklahoma, and so on. So this is a moment, the late 1960s, early 1970s, when there's an opening up in the academia, but not just the academia. As I mentioned, there were important cultural figures from Romania who were able to travel. So my father was a professor of comparative literature in Romania. This gave him a tremendous advantage because when he came, it wasn't just presenting Romanian culture. What he did was obviously compare various cultures to each other. And in Romania, most of what he did was trying to understand how foreign cultures impacted the Romanian culture. His dissertation, his PhD dissertation, was on Shakespeare and how Shakespeare had been understood in the Romanian culture. He had translated Bernard Shaw, he had translated some Shakespeare as well. Shelley, he wrote a book about it. So he was very much an Anglist, as you would call it, in Romania, interested in British and American literature. When he came here, he did the other. He did the opposite in a sense. He presented to American students kind of how the Romanian culture can be interpreted from an American perspective. So I would argue that he was in a great position, and he taught at the university, at Portland University, I believe, University of Washington, UCLA, and then back at the University of Washington from January 1970 till December 1971, so for about 2 years. That's the baggage that he brought to the Romanian Library when this was opened.
Why do you think he was the choice for running the library?
Impossible for me to say, obviously. I'm biased.
Because
I would say because he was brilliant and I love him.
and you are right.
But I do believe that, in a sense, just...
Because you need, I mean, I'm asking you because you need, I mean, it's not enough to be a scholar. It's not enough to be a good academic or a good researcher. You need to have management skills, you need to like to do administration and so on. Why?
So there are two parts of the answer here. The second part of what you were saying, yes, he did have some quote-unquote cultural managerial skills, but these were not necessarily unique to him. Until the 1980s, the Romanian system allowed academics to have second jobs. That's not true in the United States. If you're a professor, you're stuck being a professor. You can't do anything else. You're not allowed to do anything else. In Romania, so for example, my father worked at the art museum as a curator. He worked at ESCLA, the Editura de Stat pentru Literatură și Artă. He worked at Editura Meridiană, which is very important because it was the art publishing house. So he had that job, and he was also a professor, and he was not alone. A lot of people had this experience of cultural management. So that's the second part of it. But the first part, I would argue that the selection was in great part precisely because of this understanding that it's not important just to have a cultural manager here, but to have somebody who can project the Romanian culture in the broader context of American culture. So by going up to global culture, right, that's what comparative literature really is, you have that bird's eye view which can place very well how do we present Brâncuș here, how do we present Mircea Eliade, who was in Chicago here, and so on and so forth. So I think it was a combination of his job and his focus on the global and his experience that got it.
But I think it was a tough time to, you know, when he started to open up the place to, you know, devise the first programs, you know, to, you know, start creating the first events. Later, when he talked about his experience, what did he say about the difficulties of the beginnings or the opportunities for that matter?
I'm smiling because I'm remembering some of his stories, obviously, and they all have to do with a bureaucracy. And especially for somebody who's a professor like me, who just love bureaucracies. And he was being exposed to the Romanian Foreign Ministry bureaucracy, and by the way, it's not the Romanian Foreign Ministry of 2024, it's the Romanian Foreign Ministry of the early 1970s and that bureaucracy. And for anybody who's interested, he wrote an autobiography. Actually, it was finished literally the day he passed away in 2008. And there are parts there about his experience. So yeah, there was a bureaucratic part. You know, where do you get a building? Nobody knew about New York back in Romania. Of course, they didn't admission to the UN and things like that. But there were a lot of questions that they had and they didn't know. So getting a building, getting staff. He was even telling me when he had his staff, he asked them, okay, what do we do? Do we use the American holidays or the Romanian holidays? And the staff said, American holidays, because there are more of them. But then it was bad, you know, if you did. On the other hand, how could you work on, back then, 23 August, right? And so on and so forth. So it's the little things that made it. But he did have this advantage that he already knew the academic community of the United States. He had a network of colleagues. When he was at the University of Washington, he went to conferences. He met a lot of people. And when he arrived here in New York, one of the first people that visited him was the head of the International Culture Department at NYU, who had read one of my father's chapters. And he introduced him to the academic community here. So much so that there was an entire group, and I'm sorry, I like to brag about my father, less about me. That group eventually led him to receive this very prestigious award. It was called the Emerson Prize back in 1973. Just so you know, the very first person who had won that prize was Jackson Pollock. But it's not about Pollock, it's not about that. It suggests the kind of community that was accessible because of the contacts of the academia, and again, because of the great advantage of being the first East European library and institution of culture here in New York. So he had a lot of advantages, let me put it this way.
So intellectual stature, perfect knowledge of the American culture, and of course Romanian culture, very good contacts, all these, despite the lack of resources, the lack of bureaucracy, helped him and his team to establish the library as a very vibrant and interesting place. But let's not forget that this Romanian library was part of a communist dictatorship, was part of an ideological dictatorship. What freedom of movement did he enjoy? How autonomous was Professor Grigorescu and his colleagues in programming, in meeting with people, in speaking about certain things? Do you know if there was a political or ideological pressure on this thing?
Here I'd like to kind of reach out to everyone who lived in Romania before 1989 and has an idea kind of how things worked. There were ups and downs. There were different moments. There were more open moments, more closed moments. And then there were people. There were individual people who were able to transform their institutions, even in the toughest of times, into very well-running machines and to do away with the ideology as much as possible. So it was about these individuals. My father was always very, he acknowledged how much certain individuals and helped him. The ambassador in Washington, Corneliu Bogdan, was somebody who always had his back, let me put it this way. For a long time, he knew that he could do things, and the ambassador, who was had a very good position back in Romania as well, because he orchestrated this opening of 1969, he would help my father. He said, don't worry about them. If anything happens, I have your back. So that obviously happened. But we know that it's not just an ambassador that matters. There were different people in the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Education. So at different times, there were different constellations that would allow him to do certain things or not. He would always have to figure out what can he do. Would he ask the Ministry of Education for something? Would he ask for something? So
to play the game.
That's what everybody did back before 1989. You would look for a way to do things, but overall, things were getting worse, and already by 1973-74, he realized that his ability to go with exhibits in other cities, to go and speak to other universities, things were already closing down by then. I'm not going to go into too many details, but the clear moment was when his deputy director changed. He got a clear signal that that's kind of it, and he left. So again, I think that what happened with the Romanian Library is a reflection of many institutions in the communist system in Romania up to 1989, and I dare say with all institutions in the world. There are different moments when your bosses and the political situation makes things makes them easier or difficult. He had a good run of about 3 years when he was able to do what he wanted to do, and when he realized that it was pretty much impossible to continue. Also, he was a professor. He loved to teach. He did not like, I'm sorry, I know that there are diplomats here. I was a diplomat. He did not want to be part of the diplomatic corps. He loved teaching, and that was one of the reasons why he wanted to go back as well.
And also writing. I mean, he had a very long career,
yes.
A very distinguished career. I would say that it was even a sort of career move, starting with the 80s when the great Anglist and Americanist transformed into a very influential art critic and historian, and also a very interesting theoretician for that matter. So it's been a long. He had a long career, but of course this American moment as a professor in Seattle, LA, and Portland, and as the director of the library must have impacted him very much. In which way was he transformed or impacted by this American experience?
Oh, tremendous. So as you can imagine, coming from Romania in the late 1960s to early 1970s, opening up universities. I'm sorry, I'm biased here too. What wonderful places for ideas, exchanges of ideas. And this is the U.S. in the late 60s, early 70s, the hippie generation, the fun part. It is an exciting time, and he opens up and he sees all of this. And we never had a car, he didn't drive. We never really bought anything except for books. We went back with literally thousands of books. Some of them were mine, I guess, maybe 10, 20, 50, 100, I don't know. But vast majority were my father's. So indeed, it impacted him in terms of what he saw. A wonderful, very exciting culture, even compared to what was going on in Europe at that time. The US of the 60s and 70s is a fantastic moment. So he experiences that, and he brings it back, and he brings back the books, and he loves sharing that with his students. I have met many of his former students who still remember how he would lug 10, 20 books to his class to show them, because this was the 1980s. He needed to show art, Jackson Pollock, or I don't know, pop art or things like that, things that were not available in Romania. So it was a great opportunity for him, both as a teacher, but also all of those books helped him continue his work and to write. He, again, sorry, I need to brag, he's my father. He wrote about 50 books overall.
We brag about him too, don't worry.
Thank you.
We even put it on the wall.
And yes, so to answer your question, it transformed him a lot. Not always, by the way, not always in a positive way. When you get to know a culture, when you get to know a country very well, you also see some things that are problematic, and he noticed those as well. But overall, it was a wonderful experience for him.
But of course, he didn't work alone. He was surrounded by a team. Can you talk a little bit about the team, the first team of the Romanian Library? We know so well in this place the power of the team. Nothing can be done without team, without working together, and without doing things together. So I imagine it was the same back then in the early 70s. What can you tell us about the people he worked with at the time?
I tried very hard to remember that. I remember names. Many of them I don't remember the first name necessarily. I asked my sister as well. She remembered less than I do, though she's older and smarter. But I do remember there was a deputy director. His name was Dima, who did not stay for long. And then there was a referent relații. His name was Monaco. There was a
coordinator, a proper.
I guess that was his name. I can't remember if his wife was the librarian or not. There was a secretary, Mrs. Bolintinanu, and a driver, Mr. Matei. That was the team. And
very few people.
Very few people. Everybody else was from the Romanian Foreign Ministry. And there were certain advantages to this because, again, there was a bureaucracy. How do you do this? How do you fill out this piece of paper? These people knew. So it was a combination of here's what I'd like to do, and people saying, okay, but this is how you do it, and this is what you cannot do. So indeed it was a team, and it was a team because regardless of the lofty ideals, it was an official Romanian institution that had to fall within that category. So I consider that, I would put a positive connotation on that, not necessarily a negative one. It's an institution, and all institutions like, whether it's the Romanian Cultural Institute, Cultural Center, in the American Cultural Center, Library in Bucharest, and so on, they all have to abide by certain rules. And that was really, I think that's a model that the Romanian Cultural Center in the 1990s that I got to see a little bit later also followed. The director was somebody who came from outside and who had a lot of cultural experience, but the people surrounding him, like me, were coming from the Romanian Foreign Ministry and who kind of understood how things would be working.
You had the chance to grow up with this extraordinary man, and of course you were directly exposed to his experience as a cultural diplomat, in the general sense of the word, working as the director of the Romanian Library. But later you joined the center. It was called at the time. It was quite unusual to have this kind of I don't know, choice maybe, or it was just a matter of chance. When you joined the center and worked as a cultural diplomat, with this background, growing up with your father, what was, in your opinion, the most important lessons that he passed to you and were important to you while working in this place?
Let me start with the part about this being a coincidence. Of course, it was not a coincidence that I came here. This was the early 1990s. One of the most important aspects of the work of the Romanian Foreign Ministry was the personnel decisions. The West wanted to see a change. It wanted to see that you don't have the same people from the back in the 1980s working for Ceausescu again in the Romanian embassy in Washington or in Bonn or so on and so forth. So they were very careful, and often they would say, why are you bringing this person here to work here? So the personnel decisions were important, and one of the decisions was in this cultural center that because I was my father's son, and because to a lot of people, including to Romanians who were here, his name represented something. This was kind of a signal of this is the direction
So
we're going towards.
his memory was still alive when you
Yes.
joined?
I met people here. There was Niviu Froda, who worked for Radio Free Europe, for example, who came and embraced me when I came over because he remembered my father, but especially my mother, how sweet she was and how nice she was. So for a lot of people, I acknowledge I was here because of that connection. But going back to what I tried to do, I'm not going to talk too much about what the cultural center per se was doing. While I was here, I actually had 3 different directors in the 4.5 years. Professor Liviu Petrescu from Cluj, Ioana Aurel, who is currently the president of the Romanian Academy, and later on Mr. Albuț from the Foreign Ministry was the director. So they had the bird's eye view. But what I did take from my father was exactly this understanding that the academic communities in the US are essential. If you want to project Romanian culture, if you want to have the culture connect to the American culture, you need to have these relations. And some of my directors encouraged me to be the person reaching out to these communities. And there were some wonderful things that I think we were able to do. We had, for example, for the first time here, a conference where American students presented their papers on various aspects of Romanian culture. I brought it with me actually, together with Grant Harris, who was the person in charge of the Romanian collection at the Library of Congress. We put together a booklet that was called the American Student's Guide to Romanian Studies. So what I tried to do, influenced by what I knew from my father, and with the help of the directors and the people who were here at the Romanian Cultural Center, was to connect to the American universities and to open up to the ideas that were percolating